Welcome to the Marion Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Maya Ghosh, and I'm one of your Ath Fellows for the year. Questions regarding the factors which influence a nation's success have reached a critical point of salience. Why are some nations extremely rich while others remain cripplingly poor? What separates the haves from the have-nots? Our speaker this evening, Daron Acemoglu, professor of applied economics at MIT, proposes a novel explanation. The success and prosperity of a nation boils down to their institutions, legal fairness, and political transparency. Determining institutional secrets to national success is crucially important, as many countries struggle to advance their democratic systems whilst popular support of these processes weakens. Daron Acemoglu is a professor of applied economics at MIT and a fellow of the Econometric Society, the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the Society of Labor Economists. Acemoglu has received numerous honors, awards, and distinctions for his academic work, including, but not limited to, the Carnegie Fellowship, the Kiel Institute's 2019 Global Economy Prize, and the John Bates Clark Medal. He is the author of 5 books: Why Nations Fail, The Narrow Corridor, Epilogue from Introduction to Modern Economic Growth, Introduction to Modern Economic Growth, and The Economic Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy. Acemoglu has also contributed to academic publications such as the Journal of Economic Growth, the Economic Journal, the American Economic Review, and the Journal of Political Economy. As one of CMC's 75th anniversary distinguished speakers, Professor Acemoglu will highlight issues in civilization and commerce, one of 3 academic collaboration themes of our special 75th anniversary celebration. Now, before we begin, just a few reminders. We ask that you wear your mask for the duration of the program indoors. We also ask that you take a moment to just put away your cell phones. Remember to be present right here, right now. Take out a pen and pencil, because there'll be some time for questions at the end. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Acemoglu to the Athenaeum.
Well, thank you very much for the dinner and the company and the invitation. So it's my true pleasure to be here, and thanks, Maya, for the introduction. So I have the very modest task of talking about 2 books plus, because I unwisely have decided to talk not just about Why Nations Fail, which I've co-authored about 10 years ago with James Robinson, The Narrow Corridor, a more recent book that James and I wrote, as well as a new book I'm working on. But hopefully, I'll be able to do at least the most obvious thing of throwing some ideas out there that you can then react to, and I look forward to hearing your questions and comments. And the theme is very much what Maya emphasized, but I want to also spend quite a bit of time on the not just building prosperity, but the shared prosperity part. And without further ado, let me just jump into it. So the building of prosperity was the main focus of Why Nations Fail. And we started from the viewpoint that that was not an easy problem, as evidenced by the fact that most countries, even in this globalized, technologically unified world, have failed to do so. So this picture is quite familiar to most of you. It's a world map, and the heat map indicates differences across countries, and you see that in sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Asia, parts of Latin America and the Caribbean, you have masses of countries that have somewhere between 1/10 to 1/20th, 1/30th of the income per capita of the richest countries that hover around $40,000, $45,000 per capita in today's dollars. To us, this was striking because it was obviously not about technology. Technology was available to most countries if they wanted to invest in it. It was something about the fact that they weren't investing in technology, they weren't using it efficiently, or they weren't making the other complementary investments. And it was also notable that any prosperity that emerged really accelerated and emerged over the last 200 years. This is data from economic historian Angus Maddison. Not everybody agrees with it, but even if you agree with Angus Maddison's data that Western Europe has been growing for about 800 years before the Industrial Revolution that started somewhere in the middle of the 18th century in Britain, that growth was very slow compared to what was to come later. And even more remarkable is that you see how delayed the beginning of growth in other parts of the world, such as Latin America, Africa, and Asia is, and even in the case of Africa, shortly after it starts, it also peters out. So it's a recent and very uneven phenomenon. The perspective from Why Nations Fail was that this was a big failure of both economics and politics. Economic opportunities are available, and some countries are choosing or ending up not picking those opportunities up. And we thought about that problem, and I still continue to think about that problem, in terms of the economic layer and the political layer. And the economic layer is actually quite familiar to many of you, even those of you who haven't read this work. And I was gratified to find out several of you have, so thank you. But it's not so different from what you learn in a basic economics course. We call the sort of arrangements that are necessary inclusive economic institutions, and they are the kinds of things that we take for granted in any basic economics course because we are focusing on well-functioning market economies for the most part. You have arrangements that protect property rights, distribute economic opportunities fairly, so that can be done via some sort of market economy without excessive monopoly power, secure property rights, market-supporting institutions, functioning courts, a judicial system, rule of law so that people are treated equally in front of law, and basic welfare state institutions so that economic opportunities are not monopolized by groups that are already privileged. So this is what we call the basis of inclusive markets to sort of distinguish it from the sort of the more abstract notion of completely free markets, because, you know, what is freedom if some people don't have the education or the means or the infrastructure to access those goods? So far this is fairly standard, but the part that I think is less standard is the fact that most countries, even today, are quite far away from this ideal type of inclusive economic institutions. And those go to the other polar case we call extractive economic institutions. The word extractive was chosen to emphasize the intentionality here. This wasn't like a mistake. It's not that some planners were smart and chose the right institutions and some planners weren't and they chose the wrong institutions. In fact, as I'll explain in a second in the context of the political aspect, I'm going to emphasize it wasn't really about planners, but that economic institutions were structured in such a way to favor a narrow group of people at the expense of the rest of society. That meant insecure property rights for the majority, in fact, no property rights. In the extreme cases, you could not even own property if you were not part of the favored group in many societies. It meant a very tilted playing field in the extreme cases, like in even recently, as in South Africa under apartheid, coercion and tight restrictions on what large groups of people could do in the economic domain. For instance, South Africa banned black South Africans for almost 7 decades from holding any skilled job or any job that was beyond the most menial, unskilled labor. And the logic of these institutions was very much based on the fact that they were designed or they evolved in such a way to be able to enable one group to extract resources and benefits at the expense of the other. But none of this could be made precise or understood without thinking of politics, and that's the centrality of politics. In that sense, the story of Why Nations Fail was really bringing the politics and the economics together. And extractive economic institutions are difficult to make sense if you think, well, there's a set of institutions that are favoring, you know, me and Maya and at the expense of everybody else in this room. Well, why would you put up with it? There must be either a way of persuading you to put up with it or coercing you to put up with it. that coercion could take a soft form or a hard form, but it needs to be working through some sort of political system. And that political system we called extractive political institutions. The parallel is there, of course, intentional. In the same way that extractive economic institutions monopolize economic benefits and economic resources, extractive political institutions monopolize political resources in the hands of a narrow group and put very few constraints in how that political power is exercised. Extractive economic institutions are supported by extractive political institutions and in a symbiotic way. And then, of course, the same thing for inclusive economic and inclusive political institutions. Now, I said this wasn't about planners, and I really meant that. There are, of course, institutions that were planned, centrally planned or dictatorially planned in the context of non-communist countries. But if you actually want to understand where inclusive institutions come from, it's really not about the plans of anybody. In fact, designs that came from elites often did not support, on the contrary, they hindered inclusive institutions. One place, not the only, but one place that vibrantly illustrates this is the New World, as the Europeans saw it, because the institutions in pretty much every part of this continent were shaped by the colonial experience, but in very different ways. The history of colonial Spain or colonial Latin America is very well known, and I don't need to go into the details, but it revolves around a small group of elite structuring institutions, taking over existing institutions with creating their own allies among native populations, but structuring them in such a way to extract resources through coerced labor, through restricted trading patterns, through mining forced labor systems in order to benefit themselves, their crown, and their domestic allies. Of course, we know ex post that things worked out quite a bit differently in the north. So one view that many historians held is that's because of British culture, Spain versus Britain, Catholic versus Protestant, and others perhaps because elites that came to Britain had different ideas. They wanted to design different institutions. We emphasize in Why Nations Fail that that wasn't really the history. In fact, Britain ended up with the North because other powers such as Portugal and Spain did not have much interest. North wasn't seen very interesting because it did not have all the resources that the South had. It did not have all the riches that the South had. And when the English finally started the process of colonization, for example, with the Virginia Company, they very much followed the model that the Spaniards had developed, which was very well known in Europe at the time because it was seen as a huge success. So they sent a group of settlers here, and their purpose, just like the Spaniards, was to find valuable metals, gold, silver, and a large labor force that they were going to put to work, both to feed themselves and to also make money. But to their disappointment, they did not find such populations. The North, on the whole, was very sparsely settled, and even in places where there were local communities, they were very mobile and very sparsely settled and not very willing to put up with what Virginia Company's elites wanted to do. So they decided that was not going to work, but that didn't mean changing their model of society that they wanted to build in this new world. So they came up with an alternative plan, and the Virginia Company brought in a decent number of indentured servants, and the idea was that these indentured servants would be the workers. They would work under harsh conditions and produce the goods, and the riches, and the Virginia Company's shareholders and the crown in England would benefit as well. So the laws that, for example, Sir Thomas Gates, the governor, and the deputy governor, Sir Thomas Dale, wrote, which captures this spirit right after the indentured servant stage came in, summarizes this. They are draconian. No man or woman shall run away from the colony to the Indians upon pain of death. Anyone who robs a garden, public or private, or any part, or who steals ears of corn shall be punished with death, and so on and so forth. Everything was punishable by death, and in particular, because they wanted to control what these people produced. They didn't want them to trade independently. They didn't want to grow their own crops. This was going to be a forced labor colony, just like what the Spaniards had set up. That didn't work either, because in this sparsely settled open frontier, people just went to trade with the Indians, actually to live with the Indians, and just run away from the Jamestown colony of Virginia Company. And then finally, about 12 years after the experiment started, the Virginia Company threw in the towel, and they said, okay, fine, now we're going to give you secure property rights. And completely different economic model, but also some semblance of political rights. They even introduced assemblies for male citizens. Jamestown didn't last, but the same sort of things played out in other parts in somewhat different ways. And in all of the cases where you see the early versions of inclusive institutions emerge, it did so because the designs that the English colonial elite wanted to impose didn't work out. So it was a result of bottom-up politics. So today, we live in a world that's structured by a long history that has many elements in common with what I've just talked about. If you look at the most striking cases of economic success and economic failure, and again, so far I'm just talking about average prosperity, you see the fingerprints of institutions quite clearly. This is a well-known aerial photograph of North and South Korea. South Korea is luminous, lots of activity, industrial and consumption related. North Korea is completely in the dark. This cannot be understood by any other means than an institutional divergence. Where that light stops at the 38th parallel is exactly where two different economic and political systems were formed after Korea was separated into two, and before that separation, the North was slightly richer. There was almost no difference in terms of ethno-linguistic, cultural, or local political system. But after that division, in the course of about 20 years, a huge economic and political divergence occurred. It's not something we can explain by macroeconomic policies or culture or geography. It's very much an outcome of these differences. Technology is central to all of these stories, because when you see a success like South Korea, it has labor in it, it has hard work, it has machinery, but critically it has technology. And technology has always been contentious, and I'm emphasizing this because I'm going to bring it to a different angle in the context of shared prosperity at the end. And it always comes with distributional conflict, because new technology always creates winners and losers. And one of the big problems is that even technologies that will be ultimately quite important, such as the power looms of the early 19th century in Britain, because of the losers that they will create, will not be welcomed by open arms. So this is a famous painting of Luddites, followers of Ned Ludd, who were skilled artisans who used to be paid very decent wages, losing their jobs because of mechanized weaving and breaking the machines. The story of blocking of technology is everywhere, and in Why Nations Fail, we have highlighted that as one of the mechanisms via which prosperity doesn't come, because if you block the technologies, that's not going to be great. And then the other aspect is the persistence. It's not just an ephemeral thing that you have bad institutions today and then tomorrow it's going to go away. Institutions have a way of recreating themselves in different guises. Latin America is poor today and it has elites, but those are very different institutions, they're very different elites than those existed in the 18th century. But there is a path-dependent process of change, such that existing institutions create what's feasible or what's likely in terms of the new institutional paths. So you see that in its most striking and disgusting form in Korea, in the Congo, where King Leopold ran one of the most vicious regimes, where arguably 20 million people are missing in the Congo under his rule because of decline in fertility, deaths, and executions. But when he went and independence came, this gentleman, Mobutu, took control, and Congo was already one of the poorest places in the world, but it actually became even poorer during his 30-plus year rule. And when Mobutu went, the revolutionary Laurent Kabila took his place, and Congo continued to suffer. Very different regimes, very different people, but this process of path dependence, extraction, continues. But what about the sharing part? Is growth enough? What if growth is taking place rapidly, but its fruits are not widely shared? Why do nations fail was a little too optimistic on this. We thought that because growth is going to depend on moving away from extraction and the hierarchies that it signifies. And here is one picture of the hierarchy, the casta painting of Latin America. You see the very structured, very hierarchical nature of society. On top, the elites, and then you go down to the lower caste of people. And that was very highly enshrined. Because growth is going to mean moving away from these extractive institutions towards something that looks more like justice, rule of law, and political participation. We thought that there would be natural forces that would distribute some of the fruits of economic growth and prosperity much more than in extractive institutions. That still remains to be the case. It is still true that inequality is generally lower in inclusive societies. But it is not enough by itself, and it has become less and less enough. And reality is more complex in many dimensions, and I want to emphasize some of those dimensions. Building justice and political participation, so this second picture and the first picture, they're both difficult, and they are processes. They are processes that will take place over a protracted period. Technological change, even though it is the engine of prosperity often, it will always bring new inequalities as well, not just losers who are autocrats or a small group of skilled artisans. It's generally, typically more complex. And then there is the global context, which I'll come back to in just very briefly at the end, but I think it will be in the minds of many today as we are living the implications of that global context. So, to highlight the difficulties that this process entails, and that those are not just theoretical possibilities, let me show you some recent data. So this is a picture, or two pictures, that show the evolution of real wages for 10 demographic groups in the United States, men and women, and by education all the way down from workers with less than a high school degree in dark red, all the way to workers with a postgraduate degree in dark blue. If you look at the, oh God, I pressed the wrong button here. What happened here? Okay, I don't know, it came back. All right, I was gonna point to, if you look at this period, it actually is pretty similar if you go back to the 1950s using different data sources. It's actually remarkable. It looks very much like a rising tide lifting all boats. All 10 demographic groups are experiencing more or less the same growth in their real wages, about 2% a year, which is more or less the rate of progress in productivity. But look at it from 1980 onwards, and you see a very different picture. First, inequality increases. Even workers with just a college degree are not having much of a striking growth in real wages, and workers with low education, both among men and women, are seeing striking declines in their real wages. American dream no more. So this is clearly a period of economic growth. It's not one of the most rapid periods of economic growth, but it is a period of decently rapid economic growth in the United States, but highly non-shared. Things are different across different countries, emphasizing a degree of choice here, which I'll come back to. But there are also big commonalities. Middle classes have been negatively affected in pretty much every advanced economy and some developing economies. So one way of seeing that is to divide occupations into three categories: middle class, middle wage occupations. So this includes, the ones that had the greater social mobility, blue collar jobs on factory floors, office work, administrative work, retail work. Low skill occupations and highest wage occupations. And in every country for which we have data in the advanced world, those middle class occupations have retracted. There are many, many fewer jobs of that middle class sort. So there has been an employment polarization, and in some countries, just like the US, that has been accompanied by a wage polarization. There are many dimensions of huge inequalities across the world. This is the top 1% income share, and in much of the world, it is actually strikingly high. Over 20, 25, 30% of all national income is captured by the richest 1%. In Russia, in Brazil, in Mexico, in parts of Asia and Africa. And in the US, it's not quite that high, but it's very, very high as well, and it's been increasing very rapidly. But economic inequality is not all of it. There is a very steep social hierarchy and social inequality as well. In different countries, it takes different forms. In the US, there is a steep hierarchy according to how deserving, meritocratically successful you are. In some countries, it takes different forms. In Chile, for example, which is a striking example of it, it has very well clarified social roots. A tiny fraction of the Chilean youth goes to private schools that are very expensive and very elite. But if you look at the business elite, the CEOs of the top 100 companies in Chile, or the cabinet of, for example, the center-right governments of Sebastián Piñera, 85% of CEOs and 85% of the cabinet members come from that very small private school. And economic inequality is also not the only aspect at the bottom. So there are deep socially rooted inequalities of respect, opportunity, or reality of very different existence for different types of people. Most of this is rooted in norms as well as in laws. What I'm showing here is what is called a manual scavenger in India. There are an estimated 2 million people who work in occupations like this that are highly demeaning. They have extremely low wages. You have to clear human and animal excrement and carcasses. Very unhealthy. Human Rights Watch interviewed dozens of manual scavengers. None of them want to do this job, but they feel compelled because socially they are pushed into these jobs. Almost all of them are Dalits from the lowest caste. But there's nothing in Indian laws. Actually, Indian constitution was written by a very inspiring person called Ambedkar, who was a Dalit himself, and he suffered most of this discrimination in his youth. And Indian constitution does not recognize caste, and actually engages in positive discrimination in order to erase caste hierarchy. But despite that, caste hierarchy survives because it is part of the norms, and we have to understand those norms and the inequities and the social hierarchies that they create. So those are some of the questions that motivate the more recent work that I've been doing, including the narrow corridor and including some of the work that I'm doing. But we also cannot understand the lay of the land in terms of these issues without recognizing that democracy is going through a rough period as well. So in 1989, as the Berlin Wall came down, many people were euphoric about the prospects of Western democracy and Western economic institutions. Fukuyama wrote the End of History essay in the Atlantic or Foreign Policy, I forget, Foreign Affairs, I forget now. Atlantic. And then the eponymous book, thinking that this was the age of democracy and the end of history would come. And for a decade and a half, it looked like he and other people who were similarly optimistic might be right. In the 1990s, what the political scientist Samuel Huntington calls the third wave of democracy accelerated. Many countries in Latin America, Asia, and Africa became democratic, and the number of democracies reached its highest level, and many democracies became more deeper and more secure. But then something happened. Around 2005, 2006, that process reversed, and according to Freedom House or other institutions that follow it, every year since then there have been both more countries going away from democracy than towards democracy, and more democracies weakening their institutions. So you see here is the Freedom House's assessment. And of course this is accompanied by the rise of surveillance states around the world, most notably in China. This is Tiananmen Square. Something like the 1989 Tiananmen Square protest would not be possible for a variety of reasons, but one of them is that there are actually facial recognition cameras everywhere in Tiananmen Square, as well as in other places. And China has locally implemented in several locations a social credit system that ranks individuals according to how many social good deeds they are engaged in, including neighborliness, contributing to voluntary causes, donating blood, but also losing credit for holding views that are against the Communist Party or the state, or advocating things like protests. So that is indicative of a new, more high-tech version of the repression that the extractive political institutions that I talked about used to do in a much less tech-heavy way for hundreds of years before. So how do we make sense of all of these things? So this is where some of the lessons of the narrow corridor is relevant, because I think we have to understand this balance between states, bottom-up politics, norms, institutions. How do we create inclusive markets? What is the process via which they are created? How much do we depend on regulation and public good provision? After all, inclusive markets, as I said, do require some degree of regulation. Where does that come from? How can we get good versus bad regulation? Those are some of the issues that James and I try to tackle. But in fact, the issues are very deep-rooted. In fact, they are as old as history itself. The first written documents that survive are the Epic of Gilgamesh from Sumerian city-state of Uruk. And they tell the story of Gilgamesh. So the epic starts with these lines. They describe Uruk under Gilgamesh's rule. Wonderful, bustling city with amazing monuments. No king has equaled in a temple that no king has equaled in size or beauty. Streets, brickwork masterfully built, glorious palaces. But read on another 2 paragraphs, and you see the same problem that is so familiar to us, and I've already emphasized it in the context of extractive political institutions, a type of despotism. Gilgamesh, though he gets the credit for overseeing and creating the context for this gleaming streets and temples and bustling city, is now presented as a despot, out of control. Who is like Gilgamesh? What other king has inspired such awe? Who else can say, I alone rule supreme among mankind? And he is completely out of control, trampling its citizens like a wild bull. He is king. He does whatever he wants, takes the son from his father, crushes him, takes the girl from her mother and uses her. No one dares to oppose him. It turns out this is not a stable state of affairs. The people of Uruk are not happy with it. So the Gilgamesh epic continues to describe how they try to resolve the problem. They cry to the heavens, to the god of the sky, Anu, to come up with a solution. And Anu comes up with a solution long before Montesquieu and Madison, based on checks and balances. Her idea is to create a double for Gilgamesh, Enkidu, somebody who's as strong, as powerful as him, and the two are going to balance each other. So they're going to create a sort of checks and balances. And indeed, when Gilgamesh acts in this despotic manner, Enkidu confronts him, the two fight. None of them is victorious, but Gilgamesh is forced to retreat. So it looks like checks and balances work. So perhaps that's the way to create better institutions, better regulation, better markets, and resolve all of the problems that I talked about. But actually read on in the epic, and you'll see it's not that simple. Soon, Enkidu and Gilgamesh gang up together and go on to their advantage together. And anyway, even if that wasn't the case, who's going to control all that fighting, all that uncertainty? That's not a good way to do it. So in fact, the beginning of our argument is that this doppelganger or checks and balances solution by itself is not good. You need something else. And you need what we call popular mobilization. If you want the elites and the state institutions that, of course, are disproportionately controlled by elites to be monitored, you need popular mobilization. People from bottom up, just like what we saw in the Jamestown colony of Virginia, to come up. But in Jamestown, this was in a very unstructured way. People ran away. And the Virginia Company elites couldn't do to them what they did to natives. So you need a more structured way, more institutionalized way of doing it. Actually, that's also not new. The first example that we have very good documentation on how these sorts of institutions emerge is ancient Greek, especially ancient Athens. And it really illustrates how a set of institutions evolved that tried to do exactly this bottom-up control of politicians. And there were many aspects to this, many layers. And they played complementary roles: assemblies, political participation, political debates, but also special laws. One of them is particularly interesting. It was the law of ostracism passed by Cleisthenes. This is where every year the assembly, which was itself democratically, or elected somehow, not democratically, but elected somehow, would vote whether there will be a public ostracism. If there was, then every citizen, male citizen, only males were allowed, and slaves were not allowed either, and Athens did have a number of slaves, would write the name of a person on a broken shard called ostrakon, that's where the word ostracism comes from, and whosever name was written most often would be banished from the city for 10 years, exiled. This is from the ostracism of Themistocles. The biggest hero that Athens ever had, saved Athenians against the Persians by first organizing the navy and then leading it, and was the first one to understand the threat from Sparta. But at some point, Athenians thought he was getting too big for his britches, and they exiled him for 10 years. So this is sort of indicative of the way that bottom-up politics can be institutionalized. And of course, one way that we do that is via democracy more generally. And that institutionalization is a much better way of controlling the power of would-be strong men like Gilgamesh than the doppelganger solution or checks and balances. Or what we call shackling the Leviathan. So you really want to shackle the Leviathan in a way that comes from bottom up and in an institutionalized manner. Putting everything together, here is a high-level representation of what what that theory brings together. Simplifying things a lot, perhaps too much, but we reduce everything to two variables: power of society, that's where that bottom-up politics comes from, and power of the state or the elites. And the balance between these forces determines what type of economy, what kind of society, what kind of hierarchy you're going to have. So if you have very strong state institutions and weak organization of society, either in institutionalized or non-institutionalized ways, you're going to have a despotic leviathan, just like in China, which will ultimately always try to weaken society, which is what we are seeing in China over the last 12, 13 years in a very apparent way, although the history goes back much further. In many of the small-scale or stateless societies that anthropologists studied, you see the opposite, where you have various traditions, norms, ways of solving the collective action problem that makes society quite well organized, at least politically, but does not allow any kind of hierarchy to emerge. And without political hierarchy, state institutions don't get off the ground. This is economically disastrous, but people are sometimes quite satisfied because they really try to maintain these institutions. This can sometimes be economically disastrous. Look at Russia. It can sometimes be economically more successful, like in China, but it's very inequality inducing. But none of this corresponds to the type of shackled leviathan. So the shackled leviathan instead, James and I argue, emerges when there is a balance between the power of society and the state, and that balance triggers very different types of dynamics. Rather than these dynamics where either the state is going to weaken society or society is going to weaken the state, you have the coevolution of state and society. So this is what I was at least referring to implicitly when I said it's a protracted process. When a society manages to enter by luck or whatever process into the corridor, at first it's not a very happy place. It has a lot of horrible norms, it may be violent, institutions are weak, but it may be the beginning of a process which, with ups and downs and uncertainties and sometimes failures, might actually lead to a long process of state and society building. And state and society building has to co-evolve here. Now, there is something interesting here which contrasts with some of the classic views among political scientists in two different ways. I'll emphasize one of them here, and then the other one I'll come back to in 2 slides. One is that a view going back to many of the political sciences founding figures is that if you want to have strong state institutions, you need to have some sort of monopoly of power in the hands of a group that is then going to be able to structure state institutions and bring order. So for example, that's Huntington or Fukuyama's theories of state-first political development. This is very different, and it's in fact the opposite. If you have too strong a state institution, you're not going to get this evolution. And this is the interesting thing, is that actually ultimately this process is taking you to much higher levels of state capacity. And that's a result of what we call the Red Queen effect. So there's a process, just like in Alice in Wonderland's Red Queen, the two sides have to run as fast as they can to keep up with each other. And that is the trigger that leads to greater and greater state capacity building, but also at the same time it leads to greater and greater effort by bottom-up politics to institutionalize its power in order to keep up with states' expanding bureaucracy, expanding powers, expanding capacity. Why is this important for shared prosperity? Well, because even though despotic leviathans, as I mentioned, can bring technological change sometimes, accumulation of capital, order certainly, investment in public goods, they're not going to be the ones that structure economic relations and through regulations, the path of technology, opportunities that really foster equality. In particular, technological change, as well as other aspects of basic institutions, are much more likely to be captured by an elite under the despotic Leviathan and extractive political and economic institutions. So we need to think of this process in order to understand the roots of shared prosperity as well as the challenges. Challenges because the liberty that exists in the corridor is also very fragile. The corridor is narrow, that's the name, because that balance is quite a precarious thing. But also it's difficult to stay in the corridor. There will be shocks. Technologies themselves are going to be a source of inequality and instability. Certain groups are going to try to increase their power. At some critical points, trust in institutions is going to collapse. So all of these things need to be studied, and of course I'm not going to have the time to get into them. But I want to emphasize 3 more points before concluding. One of them is that this perspective, this approach, really gives us a richer way of thinking about historical evolution and determinants of state capacity, state structure, and so on. These are some of the most important questions that political scientists have talked about, and often political scientists emphasize structural factors. Going back to Marx, but even earlier, certain technologies, certain economic relations, certain geographies are viewed to be conducive to different types of political relations. For instance, in the context of state capacity, one of the most popular theories is political sociologist Charles Tilly's view, state made war and war made the state. So according to this theory, if you want to understand the evolution of state capacity, you cannot do so without thinking that there was a threat of war for many countries, especially in Europe, and that made states increase their bureaucratic capacity, ability to raise taxes, ability to conscript people, and that's where you have to look at if you want to understand state capacity. So in terms of this figure, simplifying again a little bit, that you can think of an impulse that makes the state increase its power, so that would be a vertical move up. But then immediately you see why life is much more complicated, but in an interesting way, nuanced than what Tilly says. Because indeed, as Switzerland had to form a confederation and increase its state institutions in response to the threat from the Habsburg Empire threatening to invade it, yes, that would push you into the corridor, but the same thing might push you out of the corridor, like Prussia itself, that became completely militarized and annulled its parliament and started confiscating lands. Or it may do nothing. It really depends on the context or what you do in response to the impulses that require greater state capacity because of external or internal conditions. It also emphasizes that entering into the corridor has many ways. If you are a society like Russia or Turkey or China, where the state is too strong and civil society is weak, then to enter into the corridor, you need to strengthen the society. But if you're a society like Somalia or Afghanistan, where it's the weakness of the state, then it's a very different path to enter into the corridor. So the history and the conditions and the context and the culture of a polity is going to determine what are the feasible paths into the corridor. But now I want to bring it back to inequality and technology. If you apply this framework to technology, it has a very different set of implications than what the popular discussion and academic debates focus on. Technology's direction is highly malleable, just like the different ways of entering the corridor. It does not have a predetermined effect, it does not have a predetermined path, and its distributional effects are also quite varied. Censorship versus freedom on the internet, they are 2 different directions in which technology, the given technology, can go. Automation versus labor-friendly technologies, very similar digital infrastructure can be developed in different ways with quite distinct distributional implications. Monitoring versus empowering workers. So all of these things are going to depend on the technology choices that are made. So where does that leave us? Well, it says that perhaps we have to look at these technology choices to understand the recent inequality. So if you look at, this is from work that I have done with Pascual Restrepo, if you look at different types of technologies at a macro level, what you find is that in the period between 1950 and the mid-1980s, when we saw this more shared prosperity period, there was a lot of workers and labor displaced, but this was almost completely counterbalanced by what we call reinstatement, new opportunities, new tasks that were created. And then during this period of higher inequality, slower wage growth, what you see is that there's an acceleration in displacement, more people are displaced, and there's a sharp slowdown in reinstatement. So technology is becoming very unbalanced and much more focused on automation. And that is a very integral part of what's going on. And that has many causes. Power of big companies, especially big tech companies whose business model is centered on algorithmic automation. Global competition that forced many companies or made them perceive that they had to cut labor costs. But also tax policy. For example, in the US, we tax marginally labor at above 25%. Capital is taxed much less, and it's become almost zero tax, especially for software and equipment used for automation. So the tax policy itself, as a choice, also encourages automation. So this all brings back the question of how to redirect technology. We know, again, the malleability of technology. It is quite possible. Small amounts of subsidies and some pressure from consumer groups over the last 20 years has led to an enormous redirection of technology in the energy sector. Solar energy was about 50 times as expensive as fossil fuels. Today it's cheaper. Wind was about 10 times as expensive as fossil fuels. Today it's cheaper. So it requires some sort of regulation of technology. But now this is a very difficult topic because I highlighted earlier on that this blocking of technology was dangerous for prosperity. So how do we regulate technology, meaning change its direction in line with societal priorities, which may be related to equality, it may be related to reducing fossil fuel emissions, or it may be related to how we're going to structure democratic discourse on the internet or in social media. But how do you do that without creating this blocking? So I want to end on that with another major concern, which is related but somewhat distinct. What if any type of intervention in technology, in labor market institutions, and any one of those issues that I have raised in the context of trying to build better institutions with the mobilization of society leads to what Hayek was very afraid of, which is a new totalitarianism? Perhaps not so far-fetched, especially in the age of COVID. Hayek was animated by the 1942 Beveridge Report, which was a blueprint for the welfare state institutions that were later adopted in Europe, especially in Britain. And Hayek worried that this was a beginning of an authoritarian state. He wrote in a way that sounds a little bit like the balance between power of state and society that I have emphasized. This means, among other things, that even a strong tradition of political liberty, meaning society being well organized, is no safeguard if the danger is precisely that new institutions and policies will gradually undermine and destroy that spirit. So you can read that as saying, well, what if you leave the corridor? But in some sense, Hayek was proven wrong. The period of the welfare state institutions turned out to be not only one of very rapid economic growth and very shared prosperity, but also the best functioning democracy, much greater ability of democratic institutions to deepen and enter every part of society, educational institutions, free media, freedom of speech, basic rights being expanded throughout many of these societies. And I think the reason, my interpretation at least, is the Red Queen effect. What Hayek did not see is that as you put additional responsibilities on the shoulders of the state, that could lead to society becoming better at organizing so that it counterbalances the additional capacity and the strength of the state. This started actually before the Beveridge Report in Sweden and Norway with the social democratic parties coming to power, which pursued exactly a strategy of strengthening state and society at the same time. But it does really critically depend on this balance of power. So the question for the future is whether, as many people, I think rightly, are asking in this age of uncertainty, inequality, and rapid change, greater responsibilities from the state, whether the same sort of within the corridor dynamics can be motivated and generated. But of course, the global context, my last slide, is the wild card. Not just COVID, but all kinds of international instability is going to, of course, shape these things. And is going to restructure what we think of the corridor, what we think of our aspirations, and what we think is or is not acceptable. So I think we are moving through a period in which understanding these issues will become especially important. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us, Professor. This was an amazing talk. In recognition of you joining us this evening, we would like to extend you the CMC 75th Anniversary Distinguished Medallion. And now we'll move into the Q&A portion. Now we'll move into the Q&A portion of the evening. If you'd like to come up and ask a question, we ask that you stand behind either of these two microphones. Before you ask your question, we also ask that you take a second to just introduce yourself, name, year, major. Thank you. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Wolfgang. I'm a CMC student, class of 24, and I'm an organismal biology major. I noticed you talked a lot about extractive political institutions within a national economy, but I was wondering if you believe that it's possible that there are extractive international institutions at play. I know a lot of multinational corporations such as Nestle or cobalt mining companies in Africa have exploited workers and led to a lot of extractive regimes. Do you believe that there's a process at work that's encouraging that, or if not, why not?
I think that's an excellent question, and obviously the answer is yes. And in history, colonialism is the best example of that, and it also highlights how those international relations based on extraction have shaped both domestic politics and international relations. And unfortunately, that has not been our focus in Why Nations Fail, meaning that we looked at colonialism and we looked at its effects. That was a central part of the book. But we did not carry that theme forward to the present, and I think that is a shortcoming. And there is both a political element. I don't think you can understand the current world without the China-US or Russia-US conflict. You cannot understand the current world without understanding the role of multinational companies, some of which are very much in the business of tax avoidance or tax arbitrage, and sometimes even worse things. And that raises a whole host of new issues. I've advocated, for example, regulation that comes from bottom up, but if it's a global company, who is the bottom up? So global institutions are, of course, weak and are going to remain weak for next several decades. I think it's very difficult to build supranational institutions. So obviously, I think these are very, very important issues, and they open up many new horizons that I think we have to tackle. But more immediately, I do think that in building better domestic institutions, we have to pay attention to this. Part of the reason why the tax rate on capital is so low is because there have been tax cuts on corporate income tax, but some of it is because many companies don't pay taxes. So that some of that can be tackled domestically, some of it can be tackled via international cooperation, like the OECD plan of a global minimum corporate tax. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Simran. I'm a sophomore studying economics and data science, and I was wondering what some metrics are for assessing the power of the state and the power of society, and whether you think it's easier to change metrics that affect the power of the state or the power of society.
That's a great question, and unfortunately when you say power of the state, as I did, it's an abstraction. There are many different aspects of it. For instance, the political sociologist Michael Mann distinguishes various different aspects. You have the coercive power, that you can measure by, size of the security forces. You have the infrastructural power, is bureaucrats and state representatives present to help or implement things. You also have the economic power, which is an outcome, but you can measure it by, for example, how well does the state do in terms of raising taxes or economic regulation. But combining all of those into a single index would be difficult, of course, because some countries have much greater power in one dimension, and many countries have very strong security forces, at least in some parts of the country, but then very weak. So those are the things we call in the book paper leviathans, because they are actually not very strong when you go to the essence of it, but they are still quite despotic in some dimensions. So I think there's a lot more to be done there for systematic work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Rukmini Banerjee. I'm a sophomore at CMC and a philosophy, politics, and economics major. Thank you so much for your talk. It was incredibly interesting. My question has to do with the role agency has in cultivating the political society and developing the broad-based political mobilization that you talked about. For example, even disregarding the history of colonialism in a lot of countries in Latin America, the Middle East, and Africa, there's a lot of rampant Western intervention, which as a result doesn't allow for that institutional norm development to occur in those nations. And so in terms of like having the agency to do so, because we know that a lot of democratic protection and just in general promoting movements in those regions haven't necessarily been successful when done so by countries such as the United States. And so like what would your account suggest as like a course of action to take to continue to at least try to promote development in those nations?
Right, I absolutely think those are very important issues. So, I mentioned the notion of the paper leviathan. States that are quite despotic, cling to power, but are actually quite low capacity. And in the book, we argue that those cannot be understood without the history of colonialism and the current international state system, the history of colonialism via indirect rule, and also the type of institutional development. It sort of created the background, but more importantly, the current international system sort of empowers these state leaders or the top of those hierarchies, but doesn't give them any incentive to sort of build the resources to deepen their control or their capacity in the society. Now, how much of that was a function of the Cold War? I don't think the Cold War itself was that important, because the Cold War is over, but we don't see any change in that respect. But obviously, American intervention and Russian intervention did play an important role. I think, again, as I said in response to Wolfgang's question earlier on, we really need to study these things in a more holistic setting. Just focusing on domestics is not enough, but just focusing on foreign forces is not enough either. I mean, I think if you look at almost every country that has had extractive political institutions or failed because of either weakness of state capacity or despotic states, they are domestic choices by either corrupt or sometimes misguided, but often kleptocratic leaders, and the institutions that they formed that was quite critical. So we really need to understand those domestic choices, but they are, of course, influenced by the international context.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk, Professor. My name is Henry Long, and I'm a first year here at CMC. My question is about the corridor of power and the balance between the power of society and the power of the state. Based on different placements along the graph, is there more risk moving in one direction or another outside of the corridor?
Great question, Henry. That's something that our theory probably doesn't have a fully satisfactory account. But if you look at least the cases that we have studied, there are more examples of you leave the corridor towards despotism, and B, whenever you leave the corridor more towards like collapse of state, they are more short-lived. So there is something that at least looks like the bigger threat is not sort of lawlessness setting in, but it's more like one group or another taking control of institutions. Why would that be? I think one reason might be that you cannot erase institutions that quickly, so even if they collapse, their blueprints are there and you can rebuild them. Like Tajikistan had a complete collapse after the Soviet Union dissolved, lawlessness, civil war, but 10 years later, it's back to having a fairly despotic state. So you're not erasing those institutions, but once you sort of set up a despotic structure, that's perhaps more durable.
Thank you so much.
Hi, Professor. My name is George Ashford. I'm a freshman at CMC, Perspective, Politics, Philosophy, and Economics major. Thanks so much for your talk. My question was about the distinction you made between institutions and the power of society more generally, and sort of the distinction between the power of society and institutions such as constitutional democracy. I think we've seen in the United States how dependent some of those institutions, which are designed to keep the power of society protected, and how dependent they are on the choices of the elites and the norms that they're subject to. So I'm wondering, how do you think about sort of protecting the power of society beyond just these institutions that we know are not always, are sometimes subject to the power of the state?
Thank you, George. I think you are right, but it cuts both ways. I think you have both the functioning of the Constitution is dependent on norms, and how those norms are going to evolve is dependent on elites. But the way that I interpret at least the recent US history is, in fact, it sort of strengthens my belief that it's not checks and balances. I don't think some of Donald Trump's worst policy ideas were checked by some process of checks and balances. Congress at first was not very effective at doing that until the midterms. The courts were only patchily successful, but there was a lot of pushback from society. There was a lot of disagreement. Media completely re-energized. It motivated, mobilized civil society. But you are absolutely right that you also cannot understand a movement like the Tea Party, for instance, without the choices that political elites and economic elites have made. So they're both sort of coexisting. But I would still think, my interpretation at least, is that it's not enough to have things in the Constitution. It's not enough to build the foundations of checks and balances. You really need this sort of popular mobilization to make that work, both because of the reality of who holds power and because of the norms that uphold this type of behavior.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Daniel. I'm a CMC junior major in econ and math. You talked about South Korea, and as a South Korean who wants to become an economist someday, one legitimate concern I have is that South Korea is unique in that so many, a select number of companies control South Korea's economy, right? 2 companies alone account for 35% of exports. So when you talked about extractive institutions, I think you mostly focused on in terms of political power. But do you think a situation like in South Korea, where few firms hold so much economic power, is a legitimate concern, especially when inequality is increasing, as you pointed out?
Absolutely. I think those are very good questions, and the South Korean case is much more complicated. You know it much better than I do, but I think there are a lot of different interpretations of the South Korean case. One interpretation is, going back to President Ri, South Korea set up a market-based economy, and that's one. Another is that it was really a top-down growth miracle with General Park, industrial policy, etc. So democracy wasn't so important. A third is that it's exactly an oligarchy with a few companies. I think there is some truth to all of that, but actually, my reading is that if you look at South Korea, first of all, even during Ri and Park, it was a very contested political power. The union movement was very strong. South Korea had to undertake a lot of land reform and economic and education reform in order to stave off the threat of North Korean sort of takeover or people wanting to do a revolution like in North Korea. So there was a lot of constraints. But more importantly, if you look at the data, South Korean growth becomes a little bit more inclusive and accelerates after democratization. So democracy was a contested affair in South Korea, as you know. The military regime wanted to suppress and kill the trade unionists and the students, but couldn't succeed for a variety of reasons. And then after that, actually, the role of chaebols declines a little bit. It's still there, but also economic growth accelerates and unions become stronger. The details seem complicated. You know, today labor unions are quite strong in South Korea, but on the other hand, South Korean industry is also very automated. So there's a sort of different balance in there. But the issue that chaebols or business conglomerates are still very powerful is there, but the level of corruption seems to have gone down. You know, Samsung of today is not the same as Samsung of before, and what was it called? Daewoo? The one that was very corrupt and completely collapsed. So some of the worst chaebols have disappeared. So there is perhaps some hope, but I know it's a difficult position.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Professor Acemoglu for joining us this evening.